Christmas morning at Dad's house in suburban Denver started like every other holiday for the past 3 years. I watched my 15-year-old niece Chloe rip through wrapping paper with the enthusiasm of a tornado, discarding expensive gifts like trash. When she reached my carefully wrapped iPad mini, her face twisted into disgust. "An iPad mini? That's all I get," she laughed, hurling it back at me. The room fell silent. Dad immediately jumped to her defense, barking that I should have spent more if I truly cared about family. I stood up calmly and began collecting the 16 wrapped boxes I'd brought for everyone. Dad screamed I was being dramatic. "I'm not," I replied quietly. "But tomorrow, at 9 a.m., I'm updating the mortgage autopay." His face went white. The weight of that moment hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. Dad's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his recliner, until his knuckles turned bone white. My sister Beth looked between us with growing panic in her eyes, finally understanding that something fundamental had just shifted in our family dynamic. 3 years ago, when Dad's landscaping business collapsed under a mountain of debt he'd never told us about, I'd watched him pace the same living room like a caged animal. His pride had been everything to him then. When I'd offered to help directly, he'd exploded with rage, shouting about not needing charity from his son. The word charity had cut deep, especially coming from the man who'd raised me to believe family helped family without question or expectation. So, I'd found another way. A quiet conversation with Janet at First National Bank had arranged everything. The mortgage payments would come directly from my business account, appearing on Dad's statements, as if they originated from his own checking. No paperwork in his name, no wounded pride, no awkward conversations about money. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the roof over his head was secure. For 3 years, I'd watched him struggle with what he believed were his own financial achievements. He'd brag to neighbors about managing to keep current on the house payments despite the business failure. He'd lecture me about fiscal responsibility while I nodded and smiled, knowing every word was built on a foundation I'd provided in secret. But the secret payments were just the beginning. There had been the mysterious insurance check that covered Mom's medical bills before she passed, the anonymous donor who'd handled the property tax increases when the neighborhood got reassessed, the lottery ticket Beth had supposedly won that exactly covered Chloe's private school tuition for 2 years running. I'd become the family's invisible safety net, catching every financial disaster before it could destroy them. And in return, I'd earned a reputation as the tight-fisted son who never helped when times got tough. Dad would actually complain to neighbors about my selfishness, wondering aloud why I couldn't be more generous with my software engineering salary. The gifts I'd loaded into my Tesla that morning represented 4 days of careful shopping. A diamond tennis bracelet for Beth that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Professional-grade power tools for Dad's workshop that would have made any contractor weep with envy. Designer clothes for Chloe that carried price tags she'd never bothered to check. But watching Chloe hurl that iPad back at me, seeing the entitled sneer that had replaced any trace of gratitude, something inside me had finally snapped. Not with anger, but with a terrible crystal-clear understanding of what I'd created through my silent generosity. As I'd loaded box after box back into my car, Dad had stood on the porch in his pajamas, still sputtering about drama and family expectations. Beth had tried to grab my arm, her voice rising into that familiar whine that usually made me cave to whatever demand was coming next. "Dwayne, please, you're scaring her," she'd pleaded, gesturing toward Chloe, who was now crying theatrical tears that looked suspiciously rehearsed. I'd closed the trunk with a soft click and turned to face them all. "Nobody needs to be scared, Beth. I'm just finally learning what my money is worth to this family." The drive home through the snowy suburb had been accompanied by the constant buzzing of my phone. Voicemails piled up faster than I could delete them, each one more desperate than the last. My phone wouldn't stop ringing during the 20-minute drive to my house in the foothills. I let each call go to voicemail, watching the notification count climb from 3 to 7 to 12 missed calls before I'd even reached the highway. The first voicemail was Dad, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Son, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you better get back here and apologize to this family. Chloe is upstairs crying her eyes out because of your tantrum. The second was Beth sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. Dwayne, please call me back. Please. We need to talk about this. Chloe didn't mean anything by it. She's just a kid. You know how kids are. But it was the third voicemail that stopped my blood cold. Uncle Dwayne, it's me. Chloe's voice was different now, stripped of the bratty entitlement I'd grown accustomed to. Mom says I need to apologize, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I need to tell you something important. Mom and Grandpa have been planning this morning for weeks. They told me to act disappointed, no matter what you gave me, to make you feel bad, so you'd buy me something bigger later. They said you always cave when people are upset. I'm really sorry. I actually love the iPad. I've wanted one for months, but Mom said I had to wait until after Christmas so you'd buy it. I feel terrible. Please don't hate me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the implications hit me. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat in stunned silence as the remaining voicemails played out. Beth again panicked now. Okay, maybe Chloe was coached a little bit about seeming grateful, but that doesn't mean we don't appreciate everything you do. You're overreacting to a misunderstanding. Dad, angrier. I don't care what Beth told that girl to say. You don't abandon family over hurt feelings. Your mother would be ashamed of you right now. But then came the voicemail that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation. It was Beth, and she was drunk, crying the kind of messy, emotional breakdown that strips away all pretense. Dwayne, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying to you. Dad made me promise never to tell you, but the diabetes medication story was fake. He doesn't have diabetes. He needed the money for casino debts. The car repair emergency last month. That was fake too. I got cosmetic work done on my car because I wanted it to look better for this guy I'm dating. The emergency room visit, Chloe wasn't sick. We went to the ER because Dad said insurance would cover a fake emergency and you'd pay the deductible without asking questions. My phone slipped from my hands and clattered against the center console. 3 years of manufactured emergencies flashed through my memory like a horror movie reel. Every desperate phone call, every tearful story about medical bills and car troubles and unexpected expenses. The emergency dental work that supposedly cost $2,000. The water heater replacement that couldn't wait. The property tax increase that would supposedly result in foreclosure if not handled immediately. All lies. I'd been so proud of myself for being the responsible son, the one who stepped up when crisis hit. I'd felt genuinely good about my ability to solve problems quietly and efficiently, without making anyone feel diminished or ashamed. Instead, I'd been the family ATM, dispensing cash on demand to fund a lifestyle of deception and entitlement. My phone buzzed with a text message notification. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and opened the message thread. It was a screenshot from Beth, apparently sent by accident. The image showed a group chat titled Operation Dwayne, with participants, including Dad, Beth, and someone named Marcus I didn't recognize. Dad, make sure Chloe looks disappointed tomorrow. Last year's acting job got us the car payment money. Beth, already coached her. She knows to throw whatever he gives her and complain it's not enough. Marcus, brilliant. Guilt is the most reliable income stream. Kid learns a valuable lesson about manipulation too. Dad, if this works, we're set through New Year's. Dwayne always doubles down when he feels bad. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through weeks of messages detailing their strategies for extracting money from me. They'd turned my generosity into a science documenting which approaches worked best, comparing notes on my emotional triggers, celebrating their successful manipulations, like a sales team hitting quarterly targets. The snow outside my car window looked pristine and innocent, but inside my chest, something dark and cold was taking root. I started the car and drove home in complete silence, already planning my next move. I'd barely walked through my front door when the aggressive pounding started. Through the security camera monitor in my kitchen, I watched Dad marching up my driveway with Beth, trailing behind him, both accompanied by a thin man in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. "Open this door right now, Dwayne." Dad's voice carried clearly through the insulated walls of my mountain home. "We need to discuss your obligations to this family." I poured myself a cup of coffee and waited. The pounding continued for several minutes before I finally opened the door, still holding my steaming mug. "Gentleman, Beth," I said calmly. "What can I do for you?" The man in the suit stepped forward aggressively. "Mr. Dwayne Morrison, I'm Marcus Williams' attorney for your father. We need to discuss your breach of familial financial obligations." I almost laughed. Familial financial obligations. That's interesting legal terminology. "Please come in." They filed into my living room like an invasion force. Marcus immediately began removing papers from his briefcase, while Dad positioned himself in my best chair, as if claiming territory. "Over the past 3 years," Marcus announced with theatrical authority, "you've established a clear pattern of financial support for your family members. This pattern constitutes a verbal contract under Colorado law. Your sudden withdrawal of support constitutes breach of contract and intentional infliction of emotional distress." He slid a stack of papers across my coffee table. "These documents outline your obligations and the damages resulting from your breach. We're prepared to file suit unless you immediately resume payments and provide compensation for the emotional trauma you've caused." I picked up the papers and examined them carefully. Someone had gone to considerable trouble creating official-looking documentation of every payment I'd made to family members over the past 3 years. Medical bills, car repairs, insurance deductibles, even the mortgage payments I'd thought were secret. "This is very thorough work," I said, setting the papers down. "Who provided all this financial information?" "Your father has excellent records," Marcus replied smugly. "Every transaction, every promise, every expectation you've created. You can't simply abandon your responsibilities because of a minor disagreement." Dad leaned forward in his chair. "Son, I don't want to sue you, but you've left me no choice. This family depends on you, and you can't just cut us off because a 15-year-old girl hurt your feelings." Beth sat silently on my couch, her face pale and drawn. She'd been crying again, but something in her expression looked different. Guilty, maybe, or scared. "These are fascinating documents." I continued, still examining the papers, especially since they include financial information that only someone with access to my personal accounts could have provided. Marcus's confidence wavered slightly. "Your father has been maintaining family financial records as any responsible patriarch would." I walked over to my desk and retrieved a small digital recorder, placing it on the coffee table next to the legal papers. "Before we continue," I said, "I think you should hear something." I pressed play, and Dad's voice filled the room, recorded during one of his late-night drunk calls 2 months earlier, when he'd thought I was more sympathetic. "The casino debts are killing me, son. I know I promised I'd stopped gambling, but Vegas was calling my name. Lost $8,000 in one weekend. Beth doesn't know. Nobody knows except you now. I need help one more time, and then I'm done for good. I swear on your mother's grave." Dad's face went ashen, as his own voice continued describing in detail how he'd fabricated medical emergencies to extract money from me, how he'd coached Beth to create fictional car troubles, how they'd all agreed to work Dwayne for holiday and birthday cash. Marcus was frantically gathering his papers, but I wasn't finished. "Marcus," I said conversationally, "I'm curious about your legal credentials. Which law school did you attend?" "That's irrelevant to the matter at hand," he stammered. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a screen capture I'd prepared. According to the Colorado Bar Association website, no attorney named Marcus Williams is licensed to practice law in this state. In fact, according to Beth's Facebook page, Marcus Williams is her boyfriend of 6 months, currently employed as a used car salesman in Thornton. Beth's face crumpled as Marcus dropped his briefcase and headed for the door. "This was your brilliant legal strategy," I asked Dad quietly. "Fake lawyer, forged documents, and emotional blackmail." Dad stood up slowly, his hands shaking with rage or fear. You recorded private conversations with your own father? I recorded the conversations where you confessed to 3 years of fraud, I corrected. Which brings me to my next point. I walked back to my desk and retrieved another set of papers, these bearing the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service. I've been in contact with Agent Sarah Chen at the IRS regarding some inconsistencies in my family's reported income versus their apparent standard of living. Turns out, accepting substantial unreported gifts while collecting government benefits constitutes federal fraud. The room went completely silent except for the sound of Beth's quiet sobbing. The investigation has been ongoing for 6 weeks, I continued. Every payment I made to each of you has been documented and reported. Every false emergency, every manufactured crisis, every lie about medical bills and car repairs. Dad collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had given out. You turned us into the IRS? I turned in a fraud scheme, I replied. The fact that it involved my family doesn't make it less illegal. Marcus had fled entirely, leaving his briefcase behind. Beth was now crying openly, her hands covering her face in shame and terror. Dwayne, please, she whispered through her tears. I never wanted it to go this far. Dad said it was just borrowing that we'd pay you back someday. With what money, Beth? You haven't held a steady job in 4 years. Dad's gambling addiction has consumed everything he touches. And now, you're both facing federal charges for organized fraud. The weight of consequences was finally settling over them, like a heavy blanket. Dad looked older than his 68 years, his face gray and drawn. Beth was shaking with the realization that her participation in the scheme had criminal implications. What happens now? Dad asked quietly. Now you learn what accountability looks like, I replied. And I learn what it feels like to stop enabling the people I love. Agent Sarah Chen arrived at my house exactly 1 hour after I'd called her, accompanied by 2 other federal investigators, whose presence transformed my living room into an impromptu interrogation center. Dad and Beth sat frozen on my couch, while the agents methodically laid out 3 years' worth of evidence across my coffee table. Mr. Morrison. Agent Chen addressed Dad with professional courtesy. We've been investigating unreported income in your household for the past 2 months. Your son's cooperation has been invaluable in documenting the scope of the fraud. Dad's voice cracked when he spoke. How long has this investigation been going on? Since October, I answered before Agent Chen could respond. When I realized the pattern of emergencies was too convenient to be coincidental. Agent Chen opened her tablet and began reading from official charges. Mr. Harold Morrison, you're facing federal charges for welfare fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud government assistance programs. Mrs. Elizabeth Carson, you're facing similar charges, plus additional counts related to falsifying medical emergency claims. Beth's sobbing intensified as the scope of their legal jeopardy became clear. I didn't know it was illegal, she whispered. Dad said it was just family helping family. Ma'am, Agent Chen replied firmly, accepting over $60,000 in unreported gifts while collecting food stamps and Medicaid assistance is very much illegal. Claiming false medical emergencies to generate insurance payouts compounds the felony charges. The second agent, a stern-faced man named Detective Rivera, spread out bank records showing the paper trail of deception. Mr. Dwayne Morrison's payments to your household cross-referenced with your reported income to various agencies reveals systematic fraud spanning 36 months. Dad was staring at the evidence with growing horror. $60,000. It couldn't have been that much. Actually, I said quietly, it was closer to $87,000. That figure doesn't include the mortgage payments, property taxes, or insurance premiums I've been covering. Agent Chen turned to me with professional interest. You've been paying the mortgage on your father's property without his knowledge? For 3 years, I confirmed. Along with utilities during the winter months, property maintenance, and various emergency expenses that I now understand were manufactured. The third agent, a woman named Special Agent Torres, was examining financial records on her laptop. Mr. Harold Morrison, these casino withdrawal records from Black Hawk show gambling losses exceeding $40,000 during the same period you were receiving assistance funds. Can you explain this discrepancy? Dad's shoulders sagged in defeat. I have a gambling problem. I've had it for years. The business didn't fail because of the economy. It failed because I borrowed against equipment to fund casino trips. And Mrs. Carson, Agent Torres continued, these medical records from Denver Health show no emergency room visits during the dates you claimed insurance reimbursement for emergency care. In fact, the only medical expenses we can verify are cosmetic dental procedures paid for in cash. Beth was hyperventilating, now the reality of federal prosecution becoming undeniable. Dwayne, please tell them we'll pay everything back. Please don't let them arrest us. Agent Chen closed her tablet with a decisive click. The decision to prosecute isn't up to your brother, Mrs. Carson. Federal fraud charges proceed based on evidence, not family relationships. Dad looked up at me with something resembling the father I'd once respected. Son, I know I've destroyed everything good between us. But please think about Chloe. She doesn't deserve to watch her grandfather and mother go to prison. Chloe deserves to understand that actions have consequences, I replied, something this family stopped teaching her a long time ago. Special Agent Torres was reviewing additional documents. Mr. Morrison, there's also the matter of the fraudulent scholarship application for your granddaughter's private school education. False poverty documentation to obtain need-based financial aid constitutes educational fraud. The room fell silent as the scope of their criminal exposure expanded beyond what any of us had imagined. What had started as family manipulation had evolved into a complex federal case involving multiple agencies and fraud statutes. What are our options? Dad asked Agent Chen desperately. Cooperation with the investigation, full restitution to defrauded agencies, and plea negotiations with the U.S. Attorney's Office, she replied professionally. Your son's willingness to document the fraud actually helps your case, as it demonstrates the scope was limited to family members rather than a larger conspiracy. I stood up and walked to my kitchen, needing distance from the wreckage of my family's integrity. Through the window, I could see fresh snow beginning to fall, covering the landscape, with the illusion of purity and new beginnings. When I returned to the living room, Beth was signing paperwork acknowledging her cooperation with the investigation. Dad sat motionless, staring at his hands, as if he'd never seen them before. There's one more thing, I said quietly. Uncle Robert is flying in from Phoenix tomorrow. He's bringing some documents you might find interesting, Dad, including copies of Grandmother's original will. Dad's head snapped up, his face immediately draining of color. What are you talking about? The will that left everything to Mom, not to you. The will that Uncle Robert has been looking for since Grandmother's estate was settled 15 years ago. Agent Chen looked between us with professional interest. Is this related to the current investigation? It might be, I replied, watching Dad's growing panic. Uncle Robert has evidence that the inheritance Dad claimed to have lost in bad investments was actually hidden in accounts that still exist. Dad stood up abruptly, his hands shaking with more than fear now. That's impossible. That money was lost years ago. Tomorrow, we'll find out, I said simply. Along with everyone else who's been wondering where Grandmother's estate really went. The federal agents gathered their materials with the efficiency of people accustomed to family destruction. As they prepared to leave, Agent Chen handed Dad a card with contact information. Mr. Morrison, I suggest you contact a criminal defense attorney immediately. The charges we're considering carry significant prison time, but cooperation and restitution can influence sentencing recommendations. After they left Dad, and Beth sat in my living room like survivors of a natural disaster, trying to process the magnitude of the consequences bearing down on them. Dwayne, Dad said finally, I know I don't deserve to ask, but is there any way to fix this? I looked at the man who had raised me, who had taught me to work hard and treat people fairly, who had somehow transformed into someone I barely recognized. "Yeah, Dad," I said quietly. "There is a way, but it starts with you telling the truth for the first time in 3 years. About everything, no matter how much it hurts." The snow outside continued falling, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of my phone ringing with calls I wasn't ready to answer yet. Uncle Robert arrived at Denver International Airport on a Tuesday morning flight, carrying 2 decades of suppressed family secrets in a weathered briefcase that had belonged to my grandfather. I picked him up in my Tesla, noting how much he'd aged since Mom's funeral 3 years earlier, his once dark hair now completely silver, and his face carrying new lines of worry and determination. "Nephew," he said as we pulled out of the airport parking structure, "I should have done this years ago, but I promised your mother I'd let sleeping dogs lie. Recent events have convinced me that some dogs need to wake up and bite." We drove through downtown Denver in relative silence, Uncle Robert occasionally commenting on the city's growth since his last visit. But when we pulled into my driveway, he immediately noticed Dad's truck parked awkwardly across 2 spaces, suggesting a hasty and emotional arrival. "He's inside, isn't he?" Uncle Robert asked grimly. "Has been since 8 this morning," I confirmed. "Beth's with him. They're both pretty desperate to make sense of what's happening." We found Dad and Beth huddled together on my couch, like refugees from their own decisions. Both looked like they hadn't slept in days, which was probably accurate given the federal charges hanging over their heads. "Hello, Harold," Uncle Robert said, simply setting his briefcase on my coffee table with deliberate ceremony. Dad's face went through several emotions, rapidly surprise, guilt, fear, and finally a resigned acceptance that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation for years. "Robert," Dad replied quietly, "I wondered when you'd turn up." "Did you?" Uncle Robert asked, opening the briefcase with methodical precision. "Or did you hope I'd die quietly in Phoenix, without ever asking questions about Mother's estate?" Beth looked between them with growing confusion. "What estate Grandma Morrison died broke? That's what you always told us." Uncle Robert laughed bitterly as he began removing documents from his briefcase. "Your grandfather told you a lot of things, Elizabeth. Most of them lies designed to cover up the largest theft in our family's history." He spread papers across my coffee table: bank statements, property deeds, investment accounts, and legal documents dating back 15 years. "Your grandmother left an estate worth $412,000 when she died in 2008. Uncle Robert continued. "Property, investments, and cash that she specifically bequeathed to her daughter-in-law, your mother, Margaret Morrison." Dad was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "That money was lost in the market crash. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what you told them," Uncle Robert corrected. "But these Wells Fargo statements tell a different story." He selected a specific document and held it up for everyone to see. Account number ending in 7492. Your mother's inheritance transferred to Harold Morrison as executor, and then immediately moved to a private investment account that has been accumulating interest for 15 years. Beth grabbed the paper and studied it with growing amazement. "This shows a current balance of over $600,000. Compound interest is a beautiful thing," Uncle Robert said dryly, "especially when you're stealing from your dead mother while your wife is dying of cancer." The silence in my living room was so complete, I could hear my grandfather clock ticking from the hallway. Dad's face had gone completely gray, and his hands were trembling as the scope of his deception became undeniable. "How long have you known?" Dad asked in a whisper. "Since the week after Margaret's funeral," Uncle Robert replied. "When I started asking questions about why the inheritance hadn't been used for her medical expenses. It took me 2 years to track down the hidden accounts through private investigators." I felt something cold and heavy settling in my chest as the implications became clear. Mom died thinking there was no money for experimental treatments. She refused to consider clinical trials because she didn't want to bankrupt the family. Your father convinced her that grandmother's estate had been wiped out, Uncle Robert confirmed, while sitting on enough money to fund any treatment she wanted. Beth was now staring at Dad with a horror that transcended their current legal troubles. "You let Margaret die when you had money to save her." Dad's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "She was going to die anyway. The doctors said the treatments were experimental, not guaranteed. I was protecting the family's future." "You were protecting your gambling addiction," Uncle Robert shot back. "How much of that inheritance went to Colorado casinos?" "Harold?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dad couldn't meet anyone's eyes, his silence serving as confirmation of financial sins that went beyond anything we'd imagined. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Special Agent Chen, and I answered on speakerphone so everyone could hear the conversation. "Mr. Morrison, we've discovered some additional financial irregularities during our investigation. Can you meet us at our Denver office this afternoon? We need to discuss some offshore accounts that have come to our attention." Uncle Robert smiled grimly and spoke toward the phone. "Agent Chen, this is Robert Morrison, Harold's brother. I believe those offshore accounts are part of a stolen inheritance case I've been investigating privately. I have documentation that might interest you." "Mr. Robert Morrison, we've been trying to reach you in Phoenix. Your attorney said you were traveling to Colorado with evidence related to our case." "I'm sitting in my nephew's living room with that evidence right now, along with the primary suspect." Agent Chen's professional excitement was audible through the phone. "We'll be there in 30 minutes. As I hung up, Dad stood slowly and walked to my living room window, staring out at the mountain view that had once seemed peaceful and permanent. "Son," he said without turning around, "I want you to know that everything I thought I was doing to protect this family's future." "You destroyed this family's future," I replied quietly, "and you killed Mom in the process." Beth was reading through Uncle Robert's documents with the focused intensity of someone discovering that everything they'd believed about their life was fiction. "How much is left?" she asked. "After Harold's gambling losses and hidden expenditures, approximately $420,000 remains in various accounts," Uncle Robert replied. "Money that legally belongs to Dwayne as Margaret's primary heir." The sound of federal agents arriving in my driveway ended our family conversation. Through the window, I watched Agent Chen and two other investigators walking up my front steps with the determined pace of people who'd solved a complex puzzle. Dad turned away from the window and looked at each of us in turn. For the first time in years, his expression held something resembling the father I'd once admired. "I'm ready to tell them everything," he said simply. "All of it. The inheritance, the gambling, the fraud, everything." Uncle Robert closed his briefcase and stood up. "It's 15 years too late, Harold, but it's a start." Agent Chen's knock on my front door sounded like the final note in a very long and complicated song. As I walked to answer it, I realized that my family was about to face consequences that would reshape all of our lives permanently. But for the first time since Christmas morning, those consequences felt like justice rather than punishment. 3 days after the federal agents arrested Dad at my house, he suffered a massive heart attack in his holding cell at the Denver Federal Detention Center. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that his first genuine medical emergency in years happened while he was facing charges for fabricating medical crises. Beth called me from the hospital at 2 in the morning, her voice hollow with exhaustion and shock. "Dwayne, they think he might not make it. The doctor said his heart is severely damaged. All the stress, all the lies, they're finally catching up with him." I drove through empty Denver streets to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, my mind struggling to process the possibility that my father might die before we could resolve the wreckage he'd created. The cardiac intensive care unit felt like a sterile purgatory, all beeping machines and hushed conversations about survival odds and brain function. Dad looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, connected to machines that were keeping his damaged heart beating. His face was pale gray, and his breathing was assisted by a ventilator that made conversation impossible. "The cardiologist says he needs immediate surgery," Beth explained as we stood outside his room. "Multiple blocked arteries. They're talking about bypass surgery, but his condition is too unstable right now." Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending cardiologist, joined our conversation with the practiced empathy of someone who delivered life and death news professionally. Mr. Morrison's heart attack was massive. We're managing his condition hour by hour, but I need to be honest with you about his prognosis. How honest? I asked. Without surgery, he probably has days, not weeks. With surgery assuming he survives the procedure, he's looking at months of recovery and permanent lifestyle changes. No stress, no excitement, complete cardiac rehabilitation. Beth looked at me with desperate hope. The federal charges, the investigation, all of that stress contributed to this, didn't it? Dr. Williams nodded grimly. Chronic stress is a major factor in cardiac events. Mr. Morrison's body has been under siege for months, possibly years. That afternoon, while Dad remained unconscious in intensive care, Agent Chen arrived at the hospital with paperwork that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Given Mr. Morrison's medical condition, she explained, the U.S. Attorney's Office is willing to consider house arrest and supervised probation in lieu of federal detention contingent on full cooperation and complete restitution. Beth signed the cooperation agreement without reading it, her focus entirely on Dad's survival, rather than legal consequences. But I read every word, understanding that my family was accepting responsibility for crimes that carried potential decade-long prison sentences. The offshore accounts Uncle Robert documented contained sufficient funds for full restitution. Agent Chen continued, plus penalties and interest. Your father's cooperation regarding the inheritance theft will be factored into sentencing recommendations. Uncle Robert arrived that evening carrying legal documents that would transfer the stolen inheritance back to its rightful owner, while providing for Dad's medical expenses and basic living needs. I've arranged for Harold to live in a supervised cardiac care facility in Lakewood, he explained. He'll receive the medical attention he needs while serving house arrest. The facility specializes in federal offenders with serious health conditions. What about Beth and Chloe? I asked. Beth's charges are being reduced to misdemeanor fraud in exchange for cooperation and community service. Agent Chen replied. She'll need to complete job training and maintain steady employment as part of her probation terms. And Chloe's scholarship fraud charges are being dropped entirely, Uncle Robert said. She's 15 years old and was following adult instructions. The court sees her as a victim of the scheme rather than a participant. Dad regained consciousness on the fourth day, his voice weak, but his eyes clear for the first time in years. The medical team had stabilized his condition enough for brief conversations, and he'd asked to speak with each family member privately. When my turn came, I found him staring at the hospital ceiling with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something that might have been relief. Son, he whispered, I need you to know that every lie I told, every scheme I created, started from a place of love. I was trying to protect everyone from my failures. Dad, you can't protect people by deceiving them, I replied. And you can't solve problems by creating bigger problems. I know that now. The heart attack, lying here thinking I might die, it's given me clarity I haven't had in years. He turned his head to look at me directly. I want to make things right. All of it. Starting with accepting responsibility for what I've done to this family. Over the following weeks, as Dad slowly recovered enough for bypass surgery, our family began a different kind of healing process. Beth enrolled in a nursing program at Community College of Denver, using her probation requirements as motivation for career change she'd avoided for years. Chloe transferred from her fraudulent private school to nearby Chatfield High School, where she volunteered for community service hours that weren't required by any court order. Something about watching her grandfather nearly die had transformed her perspective on gratitude and consequences. Uncle Dwayne, she said during one of our hospital visits, I want to apologize for Christmas morning. Not because anyone told me to, but because I understand now what I did. What do you understand? I asked. I hurt someone who's been taking care of me my whole life. I acted like a spoiled brat because Mom and Grandpa taught me that being ungrateful would get me better gifts. But you've been giving me gifts I didn't even know about. Safety and stability, and a family that doesn't have to worry about losing everything. The cardiac rehabilitation facility in Lakewood became our family's neutral ground for weekly meetings with a court-appointed family counselor named Dr. Sarah Mitchell. These sessions forced conversations we'd avoided for decades, addressing patterns of manipulation and enabling that had poisoned our relationships long before the fraud scheme began. Harold, Dr. Mitchell asked during one particularly difficult session, when did you first realize that dishonesty had become your primary coping mechanism? Dad considered the question carefully before answering. Probably when my own father taught me that admitting weakness was worse than lying about strength. I learned early that family disappointment was more painful than family deception. And Beth, when did you first recognize that you were participating in manipulating Dwayne, rather than honestly asking for help? Beth wiped tears from her eyes as she responded. When I realized I was teaching Chloe to see Uncle Dwayne as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. The sessions were emotionally exhausting, but they created space for genuine accountability that our family had never experienced. Dad's fragile health meant he couldn't retreat into anger or defensiveness when confronted with the consequences of his actions. The heart attack saved my life, he said during one session. Not medically, but spiritually. I was killing myself and my family with lies, and I couldn't see any way to stop until my body forced the truth. By spring, Dad had recovered enough to move to the supervised housing facility, where he would spend the next 18 months under federal supervision while completing community service and attending gambling addiction counseling. Beth graduated from her nursing program with honors, accepting a position at the same hospital where Dad had received cardiac care. Her first day of work coincided with her final probation check-in, marking the end of her legal obligations and the beginning of genuine independence. Chloe finished her sophomore year at public school with grades that reflected actual effort rather than academic entitlement. She'd started a volunteer program visiting elderly patients at Dad's care facility, spending her weekends reading to cardiac patients who had limited family support. I learned something important from Grandpa's situation, she told me during one of our monthly dinners. Lying always costs more than telling the truth. It just costs it later with interest. The federal restitution payments had returned over $400,000 to various agencies that Dad and Beth had defrauded. The remaining inheritance money was placed in educational trust funds for Chloe's college expenses and emergency medical accounts for Dad's ongoing cardiac care. I don't want any money that came from dishonesty, I'd told Uncle Robert when he'd offered to transfer the inheritance to my name. Use it to fix what Dad broke and save whatever's left for Chloe's future. Your mother would be proud of that decision, he'd replied. She always said you had more integrity than the rest of us combined. The summer brought a new family tradition, Sunday dinners at my house where Dad would arrive with his portable heart monitor, and Beth would bring updates on her nursing career. Chloe would usually show up with homework or college preparation materials, using these gatherings to ask questions about life planning and personal responsibility. These dinners were different from our previous family gatherings. Conversations focused on genuine interests rather than manufactured crises. No one asked for money, because everyone understood that financial independence was part of their healing process. Dwayne. Dad said during one particularly peaceful Sunday evening, I need to thank you for something. What's that? For loving me enough to let me face consequences. If you'd kept enabling my behavior, I'd probably be dead from a heart attack in some casino by now. You don't need to thank me for that, Dad. I was protecting myself as much as trying to help you. Maybe. But you chose the hard way instead of the easy way. That took courage I didn't have. As autumn approached, and the anniversary of the previous Christmas grew closer, I found myself looking forward to the holiday season for the first time in years. Not because our family problems were solved, but because our family was finally telling the truth. The healing process hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been genuine. And for the first time since Mom's death, I believed we might actually become the family she'd always hoped we could be. December 24th. Exactly 1 year after the Christmas morning that shattered our family's foundation of lies, I stood in my kitchen preparing dinner for a gathering that would have been unimaginable 12 months earlier. Dad was driving up from his Lakewood facility with his overnight bag and heart medications officially cleared for family visits as part of his supervised release program. Beth was bringing homemade bread from her new apartment, a skill she'd learned during her nursing program's nutrition courses. Chloe was arriving early to help with cooking a tradition we'd started during the summer that had become one of my favorite parts of family gatherings. The contrast with last year's disaster couldn't have been more complete. Where last Christmas had been built on secrets manipulation and manufactured expectations, this Christmas was grounded in accountability, gratitude, and genuine appreciation for simple pleasures. My living room looked different too. Gone were the piles of expensive gifts that had once represented my misguided attempts to purchase family harmony. Instead, the space held thoughtful, modest presents that reflected actual relationships rather than financial obligations. Dad arrived first, moving slowly but steadily up my front steps, with the careful pace of someone whose heart had been rebuilt from the inside out. His face carried lines that hadn't been there a year ago, but his eyes held a clarity that had been missing for much longer than that. "Son," he said as I helped him with his overnight bag, "I brought something for you." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small wrapped box. "It's not expensive, and it's not meant to make up for anything. It's just something I saw that reminded me of you." Inside was a simple wooden bookmark carved with the words, "Truth is the foundation of every good thing." Attached was a handwritten note. "For my son, who had the courage to build our family on solid ground when I refused to. Love, Dad." "I made it in the woodworking shop at the facility," he explained. "It took me 3 months to get the words carved right, but I wanted you to have something that came from actual effort instead of just money." Beth arrived 30 minutes later carrying a loaf of fresh, whole wheat bread and wearing her nursing scrubs from the morning shift she'd just finished. She looked healthier than she had in years, her face carrying the satisfaction that comes from meaningful work and financial independence. "How was your shift?" I asked, as she set the bread on my kitchen counter. "Challenging, but good," she replied. "I spent most of the morning with an elderly cardiac patient who reminded me a lot of Dad. Same stubbornness, same resistance to following medical advice." "What did you tell him?" "That his family needed him to take his recovery seriously, because watching someone you love destroy themselves is harder than losing them to circumstances beyond anyone's control." Dad, who was listening from the living room, called out, "That patient is lucky to have a nurse who understands the family perspective." Chloe burst through my front door with the energy of a 17-year-old who just finished her final exams before winter break. She was carrying a small gift bag and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had been rare during her earlier teenage years. "Uncle Dwayne, I have news," she announced. "I got accepted to University of Colorado with a partial scholarship for community service. And I got a part-time job at the hospital where Mom works." "That's fantastic," I said, genuinely proud of her academic achievements. "What kind of work at the hospital?" "Patient advocate assistant. I'll be helping elderly patients navigate insurance paperwork and connect with family members. Basically, I'll be doing the opposite of what our family used to do to you." Beth laughed from the kitchen. She's been preparing for that job all year by organizing Grandpa's medical appointments and insurance claims. "Someone needs to keep him honest about taking his medications," Chloe said with mock seriousness. "He thinks heart disease is something he can negotiate with." Dad smiled at the gentle teasing, a dynamic that would have triggered defensiveness and anger just months earlier. "Your generation doesn't understand that admitting weakness was considered shameful when I was growing up. Your generation didn't understand that asking for help is different from admitting weakness," Chloe replied. "Uncle Dwayne taught me that." We gathered around my dining room table as the sun set over the Colorado mountains sharing a meal that represented something entirely new in our family's history. The conversation flowed naturally between Beth's nursing career challenges, Chloe's college preparation plans, and Dad's progress in cardiac rehabilitation. "I have an announcement," Dad said as we finished dinner. "My doctors have cleared me for independent living starting in February. I've found a small apartment near Beth's place, and I'll continue outpatient counseling for gambling addiction." "That's wonderful news," I said. "How do you feel about living independently again?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure," he replied honestly. "But I've learned that fear is often a sign you're making the right choice." As we cleaned up dinner dishes together, I noticed how different our family dynamics had become. Conversations focused on genuine support rather than hidden agendas. No one asked for money, because everyone had learned to manage their own financial responsibilities. Most importantly, no one was performing gratitude or manufacturing crises for emotional manipulation. "Uncle Dwayne," Chloe said as she dried dishes, "I want to give you your Christmas present early because it's really more of an apology." She handed me a carefully wrapped small box. Inside was a savings account passbook showing deposits totaling $847. "What's this?" I asked. "Every birthday and Christmas gift you've given me since I was little. I looked up the prices online and saved money from my job to pay you back. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand the value of what you'd been giving me." Dad and Beth stopped their conversation to listen as Chloe continued. "I realized that the iPad mini you gave me last Christmas wasn't just a tablet. It represented hours of your work, thoughtful consideration of what I might enjoy, and your desire to make me happy. When I threw it back at you, I was rejecting all of that effort and love." "Chloe, you don't need to pay me back for gifts," I said gently. "I know. But saving that money taught me something important about gratitude and effort. Every dollar in that account represents time I spent working, instead of just expecting things to be given to me." Beth was wiping tears from her eyes as she listened to her daughter's explanation. "She's been working at a local restaurant after school since September specifically to save money for this." "What made you want to do this?" I asked Chloe. "Watching Grandpa almost die made me realize that time with people you love is limited. I didn't want to waste any more time being the kind of person who takes advantage of generosity instead of appreciating it." As the evening wound down, we gathered in my living room for the quiet conversation that had become our new Christmas Eve tradition. No manufactured drama, no expensive gifts to compensate for emotional dysfunction, just honest reflection on the year behind us and hopes for the year ahead. "This time last year," Beth said quietly, "I thought our family was falling apart because Dwayne had stopped enabling our bad behavior. I was angry and scared and desperate to maintain the financial support that had become our normal." "What do you understand differently now?" Dad asked. "That falling apart was the best thing that could have happened to us. We weren't a family built on love and respect. We were a business relationship built on manipulation and guilt. Dwayne's refusal to continue funding that relationship forced us to become actual people instead of professional victims." Dad nodded slowly. "I spent so many years convinced that providing for family meant protecting them from consequences. I thought love meant making sure no one ever had to face uncomfortable truths." "What do you think love means now?" I asked. "Love means caring enough about someone to let them grow into who they're supposed to be, even when that growth is painful to watch." Chloe was curled up in my reading chair, looking more mature than her 17 years. "I think love means being honest about who you are, instead of pretending to be who you think other people want." "That's a hard lesson at any age," I observed, "but especially at 17. "Maybe, but dishonesty is harder in the long run. Grandpa's heart attack proved that." As my family prepared to leave for the night, Dad pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Son, I know I can never fully make up for the years of manipulation and lies. But I want you to know that watching you set boundaries and demand honesty probably saved my life." "How so?" "If you'd kept enabling my gambling and fraud, I would have kept escalating until something much worse than a heart attack caught up with me. Your courage to say no gave me the opportunity to say yes to getting help. I wasn't trying to save you, Dad. I was trying to save myself. I know. But sometimes saving yourself is the most loving thing you can do for the people around you. After everyone left, I sat in my quiet living room, looking at Chloe's savings account passbook and Dad's handmade bookmark. Two gifts that represented genuine thought effort and personal growth rather than financial obligation or emotional manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Beth. Thank you for the best Christmas our family has ever had. Not because of anything you gave us, but because of what you refused to give us. Love you. Another message from Chloe. Looking forward to many more holidays built on truth instead of lies. Thank you for teaching me that honest relationships are worth more than expensive gifts. And finally, a message from Dad. Merry Christmas to the son who loved me enough to let me fail. Tomorrow begins year 2 of building something real together. I turned off the living room lights and looked out at the snow-covered mountains visible from my window. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks were celebrating the approaching new year. But inside my house, the quiet felt more celebratory than any noise could have been. For the first time in years, my family was built on a foundation that could support the weight of genuine love, honest communication, and mutual respect. It had taken federal charges, a heart attack, and months of painful accountability to reach this point, but the result was worth every difficult conversation and uncomfortable truth. The old family structure built on lies and manipulation had collapsed completely. In its place, we'd constructed something smaller, but infinitely stronger relationships based on who we actually were, rather than who we pretended to be. As I prepared for bed, I realized that this Christmas had given me the one gift I'd been searching for, without knowing it, a family I could trust with the truth, and who trusted me with theirs. The foundation was solid now. Whatever we built on it would last. I'd love to hear from you about this story's themes of family boundaries and accountability. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between enabling someone you love and setting boundaries that force them to face consequences? How did that experience change your understanding of what real love looks like in challenging relationships? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a like if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about resilience and family dynamics, and share this with anyone who might need to hear about the power of choosing truth over comfort. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me, and I hope this story reminded you that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's self-destruction. Until next time, remember that authentic relationships require the courage to disappoint people who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths.